My name's Jack Estel. I'm a lecturer here at San Jose State in the economics department. I teach a class of principles of micro, and I also teach a class in the economics of entrepreneurship. This lecture series was started in the fall of 2001, named after David S. Saurman, who passed away unexpectedly here, who was one of my mentors and who we miss every day. Our goal here is challenging ideas and developing critical thinking in an environment of respect for intellectual discourse. As we have said before, I hope you will relax and ponder and enjoy Terry Anderson tonight as he outlines his plan for a new political party, the Green Tea Party. Feel free to loosen up your wallets and provide donations to the formation of the party. We will provide a question and answer period after Terry has made his comments. And it's our hope that this lecture series encourages new ideas and a greater appreciation for well-reasoned and diverse opinions. I'd like to welcome Terry Anderson, who's joining us tonight. He is the executive director of the Property and Environment Research Center, which is located in Bozeman, Montana. Terry is also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute and has been a visiting scholar at Oxford University, the University of Basel, and Cornell University Law School. He received his Ph.D. in economics from the University of Washington and was awarded a Fulbright Research Fellowship at Canterbury University. Terry is very widely published in professional journals and the popular press. His last two books, and I guess this is now a little outdated as you have a new book today, unfortunately we couldn't bring it with us, include The Not So Wild West, Property Rights on the Frontier, and you have to admit it's getting better, from economic prosperity to environmental prosperity. So please join me in welcoming Professor Terry Anderson.
Well, thank you, Jack. Great pleasure to be here. I don't really have anything provocative to say, so it probably won't fit the theme of the lecture series. But I'll see if I can fix that. I provided Jack with the bio, and I gave him the short version, which leaves out the part that I have a BS degree. I figure that's pretty redundant for both an economist and a retired professor. It is a pleasure to be here, to see some old friends. And I was going to put in my PowerPoint, but I didn't get the picture in time, a picture of our deck in Montana, which this morning had 1 foot of new snow on it. That's why it's really a pleasure to be here. We could be shoveling out right now. And coming down to the Bay Area and being at Hoover and having the opportunity to come here means we didn't shovel this morning. I much prefer white flower petals on trees to white snow falling from the sky. You're going to hear Michael Boskin, who will be, I'm sure, more provocative and much more of the sort of academic lecture you might expect here. But as Jack hinted, this is really not an academic lecture. This is part of a launch of a major new campaign, a campaign for the presidency of the United States, indeed. Now, you may, if you're a little like I am, you turn on the evening news and you see Mitt Santorum or Newt Romney or Rick Gingrich, and you get kind of tired of you know, who they are and what they stand for, if they stand for anything. And so it becomes rather difficult to choose a candidate. But I'm here to announce that there is a candidate that I have no doubt after you hear what he stands for, you too will want to support him. He's come along with me, Kermit the Frog for president. And I want to try and convince you that Kermit is the one that you should vote for come time. First off, unlike the Republicans who have to have a whole separate mascot, Kermit, not good. Shoot. Sit up there a little better, Kermit. It's not a good way to start your campaign. The Republicans have to have their own mascot, a thick-skinned pachyderm. The Democrats have a jackass. Kermit is the GTP party's mascot. He, the frog, doesn't need a separate mascot. Kermit's also well-suited to be a candidate for the Green Tea Party because he, better than anyone, just knows it isn't easy being green. Kermit, indeed, is fairly conservative, and if you're conservative or, if you will, market-oriented as an economist, trying to figure out ways to put these ideas together, environmentalism and less government, more freedom, more markets, it seems like an impossibility. But Kermit thinks he has a better way, and I want to speak for him if I can. Now, unlike the other parties, Kermit comes to you with one more important commodity. He has a party drink, green tea. Now, if you're familiar with green tea as a health nut, you know that green tea is full of antioxidants. Antioxidants are those things that help us fight cancer. In this case, the cancer Kermit is worried about is the cancer of growing government, growing deficits. And so the green tea that Kermit drinks is filled with anti-deficit oxidants, anti-regulation oxidants, and anti-bureaucracy oxidants. It also has a few pros. It's pro-growth, it's pro-environmental quality, and importantly, pro-freedom. So, let me tell you a little bit about who Kermit is, what he stands for, and what he doesn't stand for. You might think you're an environmentalist and that you really are the kind of environmentalist that Kermit is. So let me make sure I dispel any of the myths associated with what the Green Tea Party is all about as I ask you to vote for Kermit as president. As I said, we've got green tea and it's filled with these wonderful antis, but I want to tell you what Kermit is not. Kermit is more about results than he is rhetoric. Kermit really thinks that too often environmentalism centers around a lot of people talking about how green they are, but when indeed they really may not be all that green. Indeed, Kermit does not drive a Pius. A typo there. Doesn't drive a Prius. Well, actually, he is not so pious as to drive a Prius. Kermit understands that we do a lot of things that look really good. And if you ask yourself, and there have been surveys done as to why people want to have a Prius in their driveway and why they look so ugly, those two things come together. People want to make sure that others notice that they're driving an ugly car, which is your signal you are a rhetorical environmentalist. Kermit doesn't wear green clothes just because they have green labels. Here in the Bay Area, if Kermit is around, he doesn't watch the green television station. That I don't know quite what that means. He doesn't use green cleaning solvents or green termite fighters. There's a real oxymoron. I'm sure the termites don't think they're very green. And if he goes to Giants games, he doesn't eat at the first green concession stand, as one of the concession stands boasts. Kermit is, again, about results, not just stating what is his position on various shades of green. Kermit also doesn't tithe at the recycling bin. That is to say, he doesn't stand there wondering where he should drop his piece of trash. Is this a recyclable, a compostable, a paper, aluminum? Kermit understands that some of these may, in fact, make sense, like aluminum. It passes economic muster. But if you look at most recycling, as Kermit has, what you realize is that recycling consumes more resources than it saves. It takes huge amounts of energy to transport the recycled materials around and then to convert them into things that we want to use them for. Often it takes chemicals to do that. It certainly takes a lot of fossil fuels. And therefore, Kermit simply dumps it in the trash and deposits it where it can be recycled at some future time when it might well be worthwhile, and make sure that those landfill sites are well identified so that the people in the future can mine them when it's time. Indeed, Kermit isn't too worried about how these about landfills with respect to their impacts on the environment. An EPA study, for example, shows that landfills account for, indeed, one cancer death every 50 years. It's hardly the case that our landfills today, modern as they are, indeed, Kermit understands, partly by regulation, guarantee that the stuff doesn't leak out the bottom or necessarily blow away from the top. So Kermit deposits his trash where it belongs, in the trash pile. If you should get an email from Kermit, don't expect it to say at the bottom, "Don't print this email, save a tree." Rather, Kermit follows the lead of Chuck Leavell. Chuck is keyboardist for the Rolling Stones, as well as a tree farmer in Georgia, and as well as a good friend of Kermit's. Chuck had a piece in the Wall Street Journal not long ago talking about the importance of tree farming, and said he puts at the bottom of his emails, as does Kermit, "Save a forest, print your emails." If you think about it for just a few moments, the places where we grow the trees that result in paper that we use are tree plantations of the sort that Chuck Leavell has. If we stop using paper, then we will convert those tree plantations into something else. Maybe they'll be soybean fields, but they might well be housing developments. I'm not here to judge, nor is Kermit, to judge which one is better than the other, but indeed, Kermit and I both know that if you're interested in saving trees, the best thing you can do is to use paper. Kermit is also pro-hunting. Now, that might seem a little incongruous for somebody who worries about his legs being eaten, but fortunately for Kermit, yes, there are frog farms where they do that, but Kermit is pro-hunting for a very important reason. Kermit understands that when hunting is done in a market system where people actually have some control of the resources and benefit from keeping them alive, then they take care of them. Let me just tell you a little bit about Kenya. In 1973, Kenya banned all hunting, not just hunting of elephants and other species that were somewhat that people are concerned about, but the banned hunting of all sorts. The elephant population in Kenya in 1973 was 167,000 elephants. Today, there are 16,000 elephants in Kenya. Now, that's still a lot of big beasts roaming around out there. Almost all of those are found in national parks and protected areas. Virtually none are found outside of those areas, and virtually none are found on private land. In contrast, there's a program called Campfire, the Communal Areas Management Program in Resources and the Environment. Whew, that's a tough one. Those countries that have Campfire, namely Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania, all have linked hunting with local people. Campfire gives locals the rights to hunt animals and to benefit and to collect revenues from so doing. In those places, the locals charge people to hunt and keep the revenues from hunting therein. Last year, Bob Parsons, who started GoDaddy, got into a real contest with PETA. PETA found out that Parsons had gone hunting elephants and culled an elephant that had been marauding through the crops of a local village. This was a campfire village where, indeed, when he went and shot the elephant, he paid somewhere around $20,000 for the right to shoot the elephant. The villagers got rid of the elephant that was trampling their corn crops. They got the meat from the elephant, and they got the $20,000 that he paid to do it. In those villages, elephants, other than the ones that are shot, thrive. Elephant populations in Zimbabwe, arguably an anarchic state, because the government there has not exactly respected all property rights. Even there, elephant populations have increased by over 50% outside national parks. And the census in 2009 put the number at well over 100,000 in Zimbabwe. I talked to a game warden who worked for one of these areas and asked him, what do you do to prevent poaching? And he said, well, we do anti-poaching patrols. And I said, well, if you find somebody who's poaching, do you just kill them? He said, oh, no, not the first time. The first time, we simply beat them up enough they can go back to their village and tell others what happens. They don't have a poaching problem in those villages. They're very proud of the fact that they don't, and they keep a sustainable, if you will, population of elephants as a result. You may have picked up on CBS 60 Minutes about a month ago, a program looking at hunting on exotic game ranches in Texas. There are some ranches in Texas, several thousands of acres now, that harbor a range of animals from white-tailed deer, which are native to Texas, but importantly include 3 species of African antelope, which are all gone, extinct, no longer exist in Africa itself, but exist and thrive on those ranches. One in particular, the scimitar horned oryx, is available to hunt if you pay the right fee on these ranches. When 60 Minutes took this on, they also interviewed a woman named Priscilla Farrell, who is with a group called Friends of Animals. Her group went to the federal government and sued the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for not requiring these ranches to issue a permit, a federal permit, to hunt the oryx. They said, well, they're our animals. We brought them here. We saved them from extinction. They belong to us. They live in our ranches. They're fenced in. We can hunt them any way we see fit. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Friends of Animals said, but wait, they're listed as an endangered species, not in the U.S., but in Africa. And therefore, you must get a federal permit. Starting on April 4th, every ranch in Texas that has scimitar horned oryx will have to get a federal permit to hunt that animal. One of the game ranchers said, within 5 years we will have half as many as we have now, and within 10 we will have none. They will not be worth keeping, a point I'll come back to a little bit later. Kermit believes that it's important to get people to be good stewards by allowing them to reward from taking care of the environment, including species. So enough about kind of how Kermit feels about some of the rhetoric. Let me turn to some of how Kermit feels about the environment generally. As Jack mentioned, the title of one of my books, which I stole from the Beatles, is one that Kermit believes in very emphatically. Namely, you have to admit it's getting better. No matter where you look around the world, when countries begin to get wealthy with economic growth, they take better care of their environment. And in fact, the countries like the United States that are able to have such a wonderful environment are able to in part because we're rich. Now, to be sure, Kermit understands regulations have helped some. You may say, well, didn't the Clean Water Act help? The answer is yeah, probably some. You may not remember because you're too young, but I remember that the Clean Water Act came about because there were burning rivers, especially one in Cleveland. And people said, my gosh, how do you burn a river? It's water, it doesn't burn. Well, it had so much stuff in it, gunk, and it was everything from logs to railroad ties to volatile fuels that were being dumped. It caught fire, and it showed up on the cover of National Geographic and became this poster child, if you will, for the politicians to create the Clean Water Act. And we no longer have burning rivers in Cleveland. Students couldn't go out for recess in Los Angeles because the smog was so bad it burned their eyes and kept them from being able to really enjoy the outdoors. And so we passed the Clean Air Act, and we said, clean up that gunk. We were so worried that the federal government was doing such a poor job of managing our public lands, especially harvesting trees, subsidizing the harvest of trees, I might add, clear-cutting many hillsides, that we said we've got to have some areas that we set aside from the perils of mechanization. And so we passed the Wilderness Act. And when we passed that act, there were no such areas. Today, there's an area the size, when added up, the size of the state of California that is set aside as wilderness. Places where you can't operate a chainsaw, you can't ride a mountain bike, and certainly can't ride a trail bike, or use other mechanized equipment. Now, I happen to use those wilderness areas. My wife and I live with one literally in our backyard, so we can step out into that wilderness and enjoy it very much. But Kermit thinks it's important to ask just how much is enough. If you look back at the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, what you find is that we spend huge amounts of money, billions of dollars today, on regulations that produce very minimal benefits. Now, that wasn't always it wasn't always the case. We picked the low-hanging fruit from the trees by stopping rivers from burning and cleaning up the major particulate matter that was in the air. But now we are doing regulations that don't make nearly as much sense. Let me give you one example from my home state of Montana. The Madison River, a blue ribbon trout stream, was declared by the EPA to be out of compliance for arsenic levels. Now, you hear the word arsenic and you think of an Agatha Christie novel set at the dinner table when somebody takes a sip of wine and keels over dead, and then the question is, who done it? Well, so you think arsenic in the Madison River, my gosh, what does that mean? When I heard about this, I was in a meeting and I asked the person from EPA, just how bad is this? I don't take water out of the Madison, but I have fish there, and I thought, is this stuff really bad? And she said, well, it's bad enough to increase the incidence of cancer by 10,000 more deaths every 10 years. I thought, well, that seems like a fairly large number. Well, what does it take for these deaths to occur? Well, you have to eat 1/4 pound of fish from the source every day of your life until you're 70 years old, and drink 1 liter of water every day, untreated, from the source until you're 70 years old. I pointed out to her that in Montana we drink a lot of beer, not a lot of water. The point was that here we are going to force the small communities along this river to put in treatment plants that will clean up the arsenic and save maybe, if any, a few lives, given the kind of consumption that one has to have. Oh, by the way, you might ask, well, why don't they just regulate the source? The source of that arsenic is Yellowstone National Park's geysers. So this is natural arsenic that we're taking out of a river, spending millions of dollars to do. Kermit thinks it's time to re-examine our regulatory framework as it relates to the environment. I said that we've improved a lot of areas through regulation, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out something that Kermit really believes is important, namely that local regulation is probably more effective than federal regulation. Much of the improvement in air and water quality came long before the EPA, through the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, were even a glint in the eye of any regulator in Washington, D.C. Local communities and state governments recognized the problems long before. Cleveland was working on its burning river problem. Montana, even as early as 1900, in a place called Butte, Montana, where they mined copper and smelted copper, had air quality so bad that the town required the smelter, which was the source of jobs, to simply pack up and move 30 miles away where it wouldn't be affecting people who lived so close to it. Now, admittedly, it didn't take away the refinery, it didn't take away the emissions, but at least it is a suggestion that local people are not totally dumb. So, Kermit thinks that it is getting better, and he thinks that we don't need to necessarily spend more money. He believes that if we are going to regulate, we ought to make sure that we keep a separation of the environmental church from the state. I point out here a picture in the lower part of this slide that my wife and I saw in Seattle, Washington about a year ago, saying that the church was having Earth Day Good Friday services. I looked at that sign and I thought, now that's really interesting. Earth Day Good Friday services, isn't this kind of mixing environmentalism with religion? In this case, it was a Christian church. And how do those come together? Well, often they come together with people believing so strong in their environmental religion that they think we have to regulate people to tithe at that recycling bin, to mandate renewable energy, and the list goes on. Kermit thinks that there's a much more rational reason to be optimistic about the future, and Kermit chose the term, he's a rational optimist, from a book with that title by Matt Ridley. A book in which Matt Ridley points out that basically for all the history of humankind, we have continually made progress, not just on our well-being, the ability to produce food and clothing and shelter and healthcare and education, and the list goes on, but our ability to take care of the environment. Kermit believes that you can be a rational optimist as long as you have the right kind of institutions to create the right incentives. And so with that, let me turn to what Kermit's Green Tea Party platform looks like. It's quite simple. It has two components. The first is one I've already mentioned: wealthier is healthier. Kermit believes that if we have a productive, viable economy, that we can continue to have improvements in environmental quality. Put another way, sustainability is a good thing, but it only comes from profitability. If it isn't profitable, it isn't going to be around for long. So Kermit believes that a healthy economy is important, but he also thinks you have to get the incentives right. Incentives matter. That means, as a rancher friend puts it, if it pays, it stays. The scimitar horned antelope will stay in Texas if it pays to have it in Texas. If it doesn't, it will be gone. Or, another way I like to think of it, no one washes a rental car except the rental car company. If we can find a way to make people owners of the environment, they will be better stewards of the environment because it will be theirs. Ask yourself how well you take care of your own bathroom versus how well you take care of the one outside this auditorium. Anytime we look at those resources that are owned by all of us and yet really owned by none of us, the result is we have dirty rental cars. So, where does all of this take Kermit with respect to the policies he would promote? And here I'll just give you a few so that you'll have some idea of what to expect when Kermit is president. By the way, Kermit was hoping that the First Lady, Miss Piggy, would be here, but she couldn't make it. I'm hoping she'll make the debut soon. What are some policies that work? Well, first off, Kermit thinks that we should tap water markets. Myself and a couple of colleagues at PERC have just published a book entitled Tapping Water Markets. I have a picture of it, but I've never held it in my hand yet. It's literally hot off the press. This is a book that examines in a systematic way the potential for water markets, but the ways in which water markets are working. If you think about it, we treat water as if it's cheaper than dirt. And as a result, people don't worry about leaky faucets. They don't worry about how much water is consumed by showers. But once you change the price of water through a market process, people begin to think more deeply about ways to conserve. We have seen water markets flourish throughout the West, especially with respect to the environment in one particular way. Environmentalists have begun to understand that rather than fight the agricultural community, and I don't need to preach on this, in the state of California where the agricultural community consumes huge amounts of water and has huge amounts of political clout. Environmentalists have figured out that if you bargain with the agricultural community, you're more likely to get water where you want it, when you want it. This weekend I was in San Francisco at a conference listening to a representative of Ducks Unlimited, a hunting group, a conservation group that actually bargains with farmers in the Central Valley to put less water out on some of their crops to create more wetlands. The result is they have successfully, without much fanfare, created wetlands through a water marketing process. Kermit believes that if we tap water markets, we'll have much more effectiveness in getting water where we want it, when we want it, especially for the environment. When it comes to the public lands, a colleague of mine wrote this book, Who is Minding the Federal Estate? And the subtitle should be No One. Because the federal estate is much like that rental car. It doesn't get washed. Indeed, it gets poorly cared for. If you look at the numbers between 2006 and 2008, the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, two of the largest of our land agencies, which control nearly 1/3 of the United States land, that's a huge amount. Just imagine a map of the United States and take 1/3 of it and say, okay, that's the part managed by the federal government. It's a huge amount of land, and it's filled with very, very valuable resources. Between 2006 and 2008, the Forest Service lost on average nearly $4 billion each year while managing trillions of dollars worth of forest assets. including trees, water, and wildlife habitat. The Government Accountability Office testified before Congress that in 2004 alone, the Bureau of Land Management, through its grazing policies, took in a whopping $12 million while spending nearly $60 million. Now, that is not sustainable unless you are willing to pay the bill. Kermit thinks it need not be that way. Kermit thinks that our public lands should be made profitable. What does that mean? Well, it might mean that those of us who hike on government trails will have to pay a little bit to do so. But we also might get better trails. Let me give you just one piece of data to suggest what can happen if people benefit from managing the resources better. In this case, the people are the Salish, Kootenai, Confederated tribes in Montana who live on the Flathead Indian Reservation. They manage millions of dollars worth of trees every single year. They have gotten the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the bureaucracy that basically governs Indian reservations, out of the business of managing their timber and manage it themselves. On the timber that they manage, they take in over $2 for every dollar they spend. That's not a bad firm to be invested in. They generate a lot of revenue for tribal members. Right next door, in the Lolo National Forest, the national government, through the Forest Service, takes in slightly more than $1 for every dollar it spends. It is the only forest in Montana, national forest, that actually more than breaks even. The rest lose money. And if you look throughout the West especially, nearly every forest loses money. So this is compared to one of the best forests, and yet the Flathead Indians are taking in 2 to 1. The U.S. government is barely breaking even. From Kermit's perspective, even more important is to recognize that the Flathead not only have more money from their forests, they have better quality timber, they have a better quality age distribution of that timber, a better distribution of the species, they have higher water quality, and better wildlife habitat. That's not a bad record. Kermit would be willing to let the Salish Kootenai Confederated tribes have the Forest Service and let them not only get rich themselves, but give us a better resource. When we look at ocean fisheries, Kermit thinks we need to privatize the fisheries. You might say, how do you privatize things swimming around in the ocean? Well, Kermit understands that there's been a lot of research done and experimentation done on the idea of creating individual transferable quotas, making fishers the owners of the resource. It works this way. In New Zealand, for example, they have set what is considered to be biologically a sustainable catch off of fisheries, and then said, we'll distribute the shares in that catch to the people who fish in the fishery and let them decide whether they want to fish more or fish less. If they fish less, there are more fish next year. Fish more efficiently rather than simply have limits on the season, and the list goes on. Every single fishery that has been privatized in this way has quickly seen season lengths increase, which means you get fresh fish over a longer period of time, has seen the number of boats go down because there are not as many boats chasing around in the ocean, has seen the quality of fish go up, and has seen the net return to fishermen go up. That is the kind of win-win situation that Kermit wants to promote. When it comes to the mother of them all, global, this is not the mother of them all, by the way, but when it comes to the mother of them all, global warming and energy issues, Kermit thinks that we need to adapt, not regulate. Let me give you some specifics on what he means by that. If you look at how we've dealt with energy in this country, such as the pumping of oil, you might ask, why do we have so much drilling off the shores? And the answer is because we don't allow drilling onshore. And if you have an accident like the one that occurred in the Gulf, it is much more difficult to deal with. So Kermit thinks more drilling on land might be better than more drilling offshore. At the time of the Gulf Shore oil spill, there was a major blowout of a well in Pennsylvania. It took 7 hours to stop that blowout. Hardly any oil by comparison was dumped onto the land, and it was quickly cleaned up. Kermit thinks we need to carefully consider the potential for harvesting or drilling for oil onshore. Kermit thinks that we need to build a more efficient capacity for our refineries and our generating plants. If we recognize that any plant built in the 1970s is grandfathered into the legislation of the Clean Air Act, we quickly can understand why we don't get new plants built. That is to say, if you leave it the way it was, using inefficient technologies and not cleaning up the air that comes out of your stack, because the Clean Air Act grandfathered you in, you have little incentive to build a new plant. If you try to build a new plant, you will be wrapped in red tape so tightly that your arms won't move. Kermit thinks we need to find ways, as the Bush administration tried to do, to relax some of those regulations, especially that improve air quality out the stack and improve the efficiency with which we use our fossil fuels. And when it comes to global warming itself, Kermit is not a fan of cap and trade, though it's touted by economists as the way to solve the problem. He's not a fan of capping carbon and letting us have a carbon market because Kermit understands, one, it's very difficult to determine who gets the cap. Remember the fisheries story. The people in the fisheries got the cap on the fishing levels, got the quota handed to them. We knew who they were. It was really easy to enforce because you could check the boats when they came in. We don't know who should get the cap. Should it be the United States? And if the United States, should it be a small company or a big company? I was at a conference speaking with the head of the CEO of General Electric, and he said to the audience regarding this kind of regulation, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. I can guarantee you that he was at the regulatory table as he called for carbon credits to be handed out to General Electric. But the small person here in the Silicon Valley, for example, who might be working on some new clean energy technology, will not get those credits. It's hard to decide who gets them. It will be virtually impossible to enforce them. If China gets credits and doesn't adhere to the policy of reducing carbon emissions, what are we, and who is we, going to do about it? Cap and trade will not work for carbon. And so what should we do? Kermit says, make sure we don't subsidize stupid things. We currently subsidize hurricane insurance when we're quite sure from the global warming people that the result of global warming will be higher sea levels. If people are standing up to their ankles in water that's now coming up to their knees, we ought not to subsidize them for being in the path of a hurricane. We ought not to subsidize flood insurance, which we do all the time. Kermit thinks that if we let the world adapt to market forces, like changing land values, we will much more efficiently and effectively take care of the global warming problem. Well, I'd be happy in Q&A to defend other policies that Kermit might have, so let me close by telling you why I think you should join me and Kermit as part of the Green Tea Party. First off, don't bother joining if, in fact, you're nothing more than a rhetorical environmentalist who wears a hat like this. If you just care about showing your green wares by lobbying and finding other political action ways of asserting your greenness, you're not for Kermit. He wants effective environmentalism that really changes the way we think about the environment. In other words, if you're just greener than thou, you are not for Kermit. But if in fact you think there's another way, free market environmentalism, then this is what Kermit is about. Kermit believes that we can harness the forces of markets which provide us with food, housing, transportation, and the list goes on quite well. If we can harness the same forces that work there by using property rights, we can improve environmental quality. Kermit came across a statement by the president of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus, that he thinks is indeed the manifesto of the Green Tea Party. Let me close by reading you a few words from Klaus. As someone who lived under communism for most of my life, I feel obliged to say that I see the biggest threat to freedom, democracy, and market economies and prosperity now in the ambitious environmentalism, not in communism. This ideology wants to replace the free and spontaneous evolution of markets by a sort of central, now global planning. They are Malthusian pessimists, I might add, rather than rational optimists. The environmentalists ask for immediate political action because they do not believe in the long-term positive impact of economic growth, and they ignore both the technological progress that future generations will undoubtedly enjoy and the proven fact that the higher the wealth of a society, the higher the quality of the environment. Kermit thinks that wealthier is healthier, that incentives matter, and that if you can bring those two to bear on the environment, we can indeed serve budget cuts for dinner, environmental quality for dessert, and have a full bottle of Liberty wine to top it all off. Go green. Thank you. Lest you think we don't have campaign propaganda, I have a few copies of Kermit's Bible, which I'm happy to let somebody pass around, and I don't know if we have enough, but I can tell you how to get more if you want some. Here's the first question.
What's Kermit's opinion about cap and trade for other pollutants other than carbon dioxide?
Well, cap and trade really got its start in the area of SO2 emissions. The Clean Air Act allowed for the setting of caps for SO2 emissions, particularly in an airshed. The Los Angeles basin is the classic example. And for a long time, Kermit thought that this was a wonderful example of government-led regulation bringing about successful reductions of emissions. And in fact, there were some real gains made by the initial cap as it was allocated and traded. So here's the way it worked. We're going to cap the amount of sulfur emissions in the LA basin. If somebody else wants to emit, they have to either come in under that cap or they go to someone who can reduce sulfur emissions, and they reduce and the new firm gets to come in. Kermit was really for this until he started some new research. Actually, as research assistant, my friend Gary Leibkap, with whom I'm authoring a book, so I give credit where credit is due, was doing some research for this book on environmental markets and started examining how well that cap and trade market is working. Let me digress for one moment and say it will work well if the cap is a very secure property right, because markets depend on a property right that can be traded in order for them to work. If I offer to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge, you're not willing, most likely, to get out your checkbook because you don't think I have a property right to the Brooklyn Bridge. That market will never take place. So the cap has to be a secure property right. What we're finding with the sulfur market is increasingly the regulatory process that govern the cap are undermining the security of the cap, and so people are less willing to engage in the trading of them and less willing to indeed find ways to reduce sulfur emissions. In the fisheries case in Iceland, for example, where they implemented a cap and trade, an ITQ for fisheries, the Icelandic government is beginning to say, well, the cap that we said was your share of the quota really is not a property right. We can take it away if we want to. Guess what the fishers are doing? They're saying, if it's a rental car, we're not washing it. And so they're beginning to see many of the gains in the Icelandic fisheries being eroded. I've been asked to come a couple of times to Iceland to speak on this, on the importance of making the cap a property right. So the short answer, which you would have rather heard, is if caps are secure property rights, they work well. If they are just another regulatory chit that's handed out by some agency to be pulled back anytime it wishes, then they are not going to be effective markets. Kermit is for property rights. I think you've got to offer a little more of a side payment to Jack if you want the mic. So.
Oh, yeah. Jack and I go way back.
He owes you a lot.
Yeah. Ed Lopez, Terry, and thank you very much for your entertaining talk and thought-provoking talk. Indeed, it was provocative, contrary to your opening remark. So I'm interested in your thoughts on water markets, because this is an area that it strikes me as it's difficult sometimes to think about how to make water private property rights, especially if you're talking about large underground basins like the Ogallala Aquifer in Texas. And but at the same time, it strikes me as an area where technology makes implementing rather fairly simple incentives to curb usage at the end user level, smart metering and so forth. It strikes me as incentives can be kind of easy to implement in water markets. What's the answer there? Is it easy or is it hard? And can you inform it with some examples of other issues that are other areas where examples of water markets coming online are playing out? Thanks.
Great question, and it's what we really focus on in the Tapping Water Markets book. Water has been a resource that, except in a few places in the world like deserts, and California is another one, it really hasn't been scarce enough for long enough for us to really get worried about it. Montana is an arid state, but we have less than 1 million people, so we can waste water, if you will, and it doesn't really make a lot of difference yet. But we're beginning to recognize that, and so the question is, how do we deal with it? Well, miners in the mountains out east of here, recognized very early on that water was a scarce commodity in the mining operations, and they basically hammered out the system of prior appropriation, which exists throughout all of the western states. And where it exists, it has a potential for working very well. What does it do? It allocates a right to so much water for people to use who own that right, and they get it as long as there's enough water to supply it given their seniority. So if you got your right in 1864, you have a very secure right. If you come along in 1964 and claim water, you're not going to get much, especially in a drought year. So the people with higher valued, secure senior rights have water to sell. Can they sell it? Well, first you have to be able to measure it. One of the earliest measures of water was a measure called a miner's inch. This gets to the metering question. This was taking a board, putting it in a ditch, well, first cutting a 1-inch square hole in the board, putting it in the ditch, and seeing how much water came through that 1-inch square hole. That was a miner's inch of water. Now you think about that, that's a really pretty crude measure, right? Imagine what you could do today with the technology we have. Probably some laser device can be focused on that water and tell you what the flow is instantaneously every second of every minute of every day. So we start out with very primitive measurement mechanisms, but we measure it. We measure in Montana acre feet, and some places in Colorado the same. The right to 1 foot of water covering 1 acre of land. You can envision what that is. It's 325,000 gallons approximately. Again, is it easy to measure? Not particularly, but today we have much better technologies for monitoring and measuring who's taking what out of the ditch. In the western states, where agriculture is important, we have what are called ditch riders. The term comes from people who used to get on horseback and ride along the ditch to see whose headgate was open too wide, getting more water than they deserved. Again, can you enforce the right? Sure. Is it easy? No. But again, imagine how much more enforcement we can do today with the technology we have. So what would we expect to happen, and what is happening as a result of changing scarcity or increased value? And the answer is we begin to see these technologies applied. They're applied more widely. The differential pricing mechanisms are applied more widely in energy use than they are in water now. But they're going to come in water, and in places where water is scarce, they are used a lot. Countries like Israel are experimenting very carefully with how you measure and monitor water use and then charge accordingly. The environmental groups that are purchasing water to leave in stream, they measure that water. They measure its quality, they measure its temperature, they measure the attributes of that water that they care about. Some of these groups have devices placed into the streams that send messages up to satellites and tell just how much water is coming, where it's being taken out, and so on. Again, if I can digress for 1 minute to the fisheries case. One of the New Zealand fisheries requires that every boat has a transponder on it that sends a signal to a satellite which gives a real-time picture of the fishery and allows somebody sitting at a computer screen to see boats out there. If there's a boat out there that isn't sending a signal, you can bet that somebody will visit that boat, because that might be somebody trying to harvest your fish. So we changed how much we do of this. Tapping water markets documents around the world where this is happening. I mentioned Israel. It documents how even the riparian system in the east, which is a very different system, gives everybody along the stream a right to water quality and quantity, is beginning to move in the direction of markets in a very different kind of way than we have in the West, but a way that, again, measures how much the city is taking out of a watershed, how much they're using, allows them to trade that to other communities that are growing faster. So this is a clear case of the institution of property right responding to scarcity. When it comes to groundwater, a much more difficult problem because we can't see it. But again, the kind of technology that exists today, from seismic exploration for groundwater, allows us to have a much better idea of just what is the basin, how much water is in the basin. The Tehachapi here in California is one that's fairly well adjudicated in that way, and again is one where there are some markets that have begun to flourish. Here's a case where Kermit is not totally an anarchist. Kermit thinks that there's a role for government in registering these rights, helping record them, helping people know what these rights are so they can exchange them. States are beginning to engage in processes of actually documenting these rights, recording them like the deed you might have in the courthouse, and soon you'll be able to avoid lots of the other kinds of transaction costs that you face in these markets by going to a database that will say, oh, you want some water out of the XYZ creek? Well, you go and you say, who's got water out there? And you go out and knock on the door of Farmer Jones and say, hey, would you cut back your irrigation and leave some in for the trout that I want to save? I think that this will happen more and more as water gets scarce, as long as we don't stand in the way. We can stand in the way by saying, oh no, markets are evil, we shouldn't have a price. I've debated Maud Barlow from Canada, who believes that water is a human right and we should not price it and we should not market it. Well, I'm willing to say, okay, let's let there be a human right for the basic necessities of life, some to drink, some to bathe with, some to cook with. But when you look at how many hundreds of gallons the average American household consumes in a day, it far exceeds what I think of as a basic human right. If we treat it as a human right, we'll be back to the rental car problem. No one will take care of it.
So I teach in the business school, and we make sure that our business MBAs get a good course in economics, and then they get to me, and I teach global business. And I know quite a few international business people, many of them even in the oil industry, who care quite passionately about the environment, and not many of them would have felt comfortable and be willing to buy your talk. Not many of them would have been inspired to stop cutting their checks to the World Wildlife Foundation on the basis of your talk, because many of them believe that, yes, the market is absolutely central. Many of them are quite passionate believers in the market, but they also think that you're not going to get out of this problem without learning to manage, that the management challenges are huge, And the moral challenges are in many cases huge too. You don't function in a large organization for a long time without getting pissed off at some people you consider to be immoral. And to think that you can regulate the market so well that that's not a problem anymore feels incredible to many business people. So I'm wondering, is it possible to get guys like you a little bit more together with the business people I know who are cutting checks to the World Wildlife Foundation and supporting many of the things that you don't support, by you guys acknowledging a little bit more about the seriousness of the management challenge and the seriousness of the contribution that can be made by people who actually deeply care about these things morally?
Great question, and I taught a course in the business school for a while on environmental entrepreneurship, and I was often astounded at how the students, I said it was like this, they had just walked out of their core courses in finance and management and accounting and marketing and so on, and they came up to the door of my class and they saw environment in the title, and they went all starry-eyed, and they came floating into the classroom. But before they came in, they reached up and they took everything they knew about accounting and left it on a table outside, and everything they look about finance and left it outside, and the list goes on. And then it was like, oh, we've got to feel better about this, and we have to be sustainable, and and I was like, hold it, go back outside, pick those tools up, and come back inside. So I believe very strongly that it's that set of tools that need to be brought to bear in this process I'm talking about. In fact, at my home institute, the Property and Environment Research Center, PERC.org, if you're interested in the website, we run a program called our Enviropreneur Institute, Environmental Entrepreneur Institute. And it's kind of a crash MBA for environmentalists who know everything about how to, save frogs, but don't know anything about finance and so on. That crash MBA is designed to give them the tools that the people in the business school would have. That said, we don't start out saying, hey, the environment is just another thing. Don't worry about frogs falling on the floor and getting tromped on by your machinery. We don't start that way because I personally have some moral feelings about responsibilities to the environment. And here I guess I'd say I hope that Kermit, poor guy, mentions that he is a fond reader of Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. Aldo Leopold is in some ways the modern godfather of environmentalism. And Leopold in the Sand County Almanac talks a lot about the necessity of having a land ethic, a conservation ethic, if you will. But Leopold understood very clearly that if you don't harness incentives with this ethic, ethics won't be enough. So I think it's crucial to have an ethic about the environment. I'm a pro hunter. I'm an avid hunter. That doesn't mean I just go out and pull the trigger at every animal I see, and if I wound one, it doesn't matter. I've got some ethical standards that I live by for that in that process. So I do think that that we ought to understand better the human interconnection with the environment and develop some moral principles about how we deal with it. Let me again digress for a moment and say, why do we tell our children, whatever your religion is, thou shalt not steal? We think that's an important kind of moral position to have to make a civil society work. It doesn't mean everybody doesn't steal. We also have police who go around and bop people on the head if they steal. But we try to inculcate a moral set of values, and I think that's important for the environment. How can that be incorporated into mega corporations, into corporations that work on a global scale? And my answer is that I don't have a good idea for how we do that. Perhaps business schools can do a better job of getting the students who come out and go to work in business to have the kind of thou shalt not steal or thou shalt have a conservation ethic in the way they behave. But ultimately, they're going to face a bottom line, a profitability line. And if we can't figure out a way to allow them to meet that profitability line at the same time that they're meeting their moral however they've gotten those moral obligations to the environment, then eventually that will fall by the wayside. Add to that the fact that so many corporations that deal on a global basis find societies where they can get resources without paying for them, where they don't have secure sets of property rights, where there's no possibility that people can say, you just dump gunk into my backyard, into my groundwater, into my well, that those rights simply don't exist or aren't enforced. If that's the case, then again, it's an institutional problem, not a moral problem, and it's a problem that won't get fixed until countries that have such institutions begin to understand the importance of secure property rights and a rule of law. You often hear economists use the term unintended consequences. I don't use that term because I don't think there are unintended consequences. By and large, the legal institutions that exist because someone intended them to. And often they exist because people intend them to get them out of honoring other people's property rights. And so if you look at the Clean Air Act, for example, there are many aspects of the Clean Air Act that allow companies, big, small, single firm, single owners, allow them to do things under the regulatory structure that they'd never get away with if they had to face in a common law court the people who have been harmed. That is an intended consequence of the Clean Air Act because the people who passed that act were at the table, and when they got to the table, the people on the menu were the people whose rights got run over in a roughshod kind of way. I don't think we can change that in business schools particularly. Hopefully we can again inculcate some kind of moral obligations to not run over other people's property rights. But we ought to be able to convince people that if that happens, the environment will be worse. And if the environment is worse, then do you really have the kind of institutions that you want? And I think more and more environmentalists that I encounter, at least at a more local level, understand that property rights are a way to hold people accountable while helping them get a moral foundation for that.
So, I'm a tremendous believer in property rights. As of, the early 60s in the United States, it was widely believed that the reason we had property rights in the United States was that we'd had founding fathers who were pretty intelligent about stuff, and they really, that George Washington didn't fight for property rights just because George Washington was the richest guy in the colonies. He fought for property rights because he really cared about stuff. More or less, the economics profession has gotten away from that since the early 60s. Well, which side do you think, what do you think causes good property rights institutions to come into existence in countries? We've got a lot of Indian students at San Jose State University, and many of them have connections in India that put them in a position to be influential. What do you think I should be telling them?
Whoa. Well, I would start by saying that again, sticking to my knitting, if I'm good at knitting anything, the environment, that it won't do to just say have property rights because it's the right thing, it's the moral thing. I think it requires starting with a set of examples, a database, if you will, that shows what property rights can do to accomplish the ends that people might want. I mentioned this Enviropreneur Institute. The people don't come there saying, oh, I happened to pull a copy of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations off the library shelf and found it fascinating, and I've had an epiphany. I want to now use markets. No, they come there because they want to fix something, and they look at a creek in their backyard and say there isn't enough water or it's too dirty, or they look at a piece of land that they would like to save for the yellow-billed, blue-breasted, green-footed warbler, and they want to save that habitat. And if you can show them ways that work using property rights, then they will be ardent supporters of the property rights system. I think that many of the land conservation groups that have sprung up like weeds almost in the last 10 years groups that go out and try to work with landowners to get easements on land. Again, there's some tax consequences and some government involved in that, to be sure. But those kind of groups are much more supportive of private property rights and the security of them. So I think you start by having a database that shows what a property rights system can do. And then you have to create, and this is not my field, you have to create a set of institutions that truly enforces those property rights. And that's a much harder nut to crack. I'll just give you one case where it's happening a little bit. And I'll go back to my example of the Flathead Indian Reservation. I have a major research project going and have been working on bits and pieces of it for at least 20 years, looking at American Indian reservations and the institutions that govern their resources. Well, first off, they're heavily regulated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You probably, if you were an economist, you wouldn't be too surprised to find that they're not used very efficiently. The Crow tribe in Montana has $90 billion worth of recoverable coal. There are 11,000 members of that tribe. Get out your calculators and do the math. You're going to find that based on that, they're all millionaires. They earn a whopping 0.002% on that asset. They're poor. Why do they earn that? Because it's under the heavy hand of the bureaucratic structure from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. What can you do about that? I told you, the Flathead Indian tribe, or the Salish Kootenai Confederated Tribes on the Flathead Indian Reservation basically said, BIA, get out, stay out, and don't come back. And it took some congressional leverage to make that happen, but they understood we can do it better. And I think that if we can, again, demonstrate those kind of examples, we get an upswelling from below that encourages property rights rather than some sort of George Washington type figure that does.
I want to come back to your comment about water being an inalienable right, and I think tie it with what this gentleman's saying. I also teach in an MBA program, but I teach all the soft skill courses, including leadership and international business, persuasion, and ethics. And in the ethics class recently, I posed the question of, from Les Mis, is it okay for a man to steal food if his children are hungry? And I have international students. And of course they thought it was okay. And I said, well, where would the food come from? And somebody in the class, dead silence, and then someone in the class, of course, said, well, everybody has a right to food. There's a natural right to food, to come to your water. So I said, well, okay, some of you are doing really well in class and earning A's. Others of you, not so well, and possibly will earn C's. Should we take points from the people earning A's and give them to the people earning C's? Well, universally, of course, that's not fair. So I bring up the example as simplistic as it is, because I think the way that you persuade people is to take them from where they are rather than from where you are, and use examples that matter to them specifically and that are very real. And I think we can't do it overnight, but I think we can persuade and change people's minds.
If I can take again a page from my experiences with environmental examples, it would be a page from public land management, and I mentioned the Bureau of Land Management having these grazing programs that lose money. Right after Bush was elected, many of the environmental groups thought that I had his ear, and that, if they got my ear, then I would tell him to not be an evil rape and pillager of the environment. And so I was in New York City, and the head of the Audubon Society, the head of the Environmental Defense Fund, meetings with the Nature Conservancy, all the big, 900-pound gorillas in the environmental movement wanted to talk to the free market environmentalists, because surely I could get Bush to understand the moral imperative of taking care of the environment. And so I was in New York, and I met with, one morning, I had breakfast with the head of one of these groups, and I said, well, I've been part of an advisory group to the president, or then the governor still, and I said, we suggested making these grazing permits transferable. That is, if you don't want grazing on public lands, raise some money, buy the permits from the people who have the cows. And this person said, well, I think that would work. but it's not fair that they have those permits. I said, well, it may not be fair, but guess what? They have them. And they take them to the bank, and based on having them, the bank loans them money. They think they're property rights. Well, you're right. If we really wanted to stop grazing, we could... But they shouldn't have them. They're not fair. Okay? I finally, after a nice breakfast, just gave up. The next day, I had another meeting with another president of another very influential group, and I laid this out, and he just said, that's a no-brainer, of course. My colleagues might say it's not fair, but it works. And so I think partly we can argue the fairness part until we're blue in the face, but we have to ask what works. Now, does that mean we shouldn't deal with fairness? And let me go back to the gentleman had to leave who asked the question about cap and trade, but put it in the context of the fisheries cap. In New Zealand, when they issued the cap, the ITQs for fisheries, they gave the cap to the people in fishing. Guess what color their skin was? Guess which country they came from or their ancestor came from. They were all British. They were all people, Pakeas, people who looked like me. They got the rights. And the Maori, the indigenous population, which had settled a treaty with the British, the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, said, just a minute, there was this little treaty back there that said all this stuff was ours. You just gave it all to those Pakeha fishermen. You know what the government did? And they said, that's not fair. You know what the government did? It bought the rights from the fishermen they gave them to, and then gave them to the people. Now, that's a way of dealing with fairness that I consider to be pretty good. If we believe this section of the room somehow got screwed, and all of us think it's too bad, then let's all pool whatever it takes in our resources to buy back some of those rights and give them to the people who should have had them in the first place. That will leave us with a much more stable set of property rights. The ITQ system works very well in New Zealand as a result. And now I think somewhere around 30 or 40% of the entire quota is held by the Maori. And they manage theirs very well too. So I think, we can't ignore equity, fairness, but we can deal with it in ways that don't require cutting the legs out from under Kermit's property rights.
Mayan? Okay. So I teach econometrics, and we try to look at lots of data, and when I send my students out to get economics data, it's pretty easy to find data.
Yeah, but to get the data, you have to look in the real world, and that's a special case that I don't deal with.
Yeah,
but,
but the point is, if you want some economic data, it's pretty easy to find it for aggregates and things like that at government websites. When I ask students, or we try to get climate change data, we get pictures trying to tell us something, but it's hard to get raw data. So what's going on there? I don't know, and I'm just asking you if you've thought about that. And the other issue then is, are these models that they claim they're doing, are they just simulations, or are they actual econometric models that attempt to show causation between man-made versus non-man-made things? So I don't know, because you don't see any of this. All we get presented is the conclusion that says, here's the problem.
Well, first off, I will make sure that I make everybody here know I am not a climate scientist. I don't engage in the is it or isn't it debate, or who caused it debate. I don't have the tools that would allow me to tell you I don't have the theory and hence the tools to make a prediction about how carbon emissions will affect the climate. And so I don't get involved in that debate. That said, I am a professor, and I never miss an opportunity to profess. So let me profess on this subject. I would start by saying that when I look at the climate change debate, and I go to enough seminars on it, and if you're short of seminar time, just go up to Stanford, and you can sit in seminars from 8 in the morning till 5 at night on climate change. And you will find most of them to be models. And they would be models of the kind we economists do for the macroeconomy. And we say, well, if we tweak this and tweak that, assuming this and assuming that, then we think interest rates will do that. And if we then go out and test those models, we often find that our specification is not very good. And so, as I read it at least, most of the models don't predict very well, and they don't predict very well for the same reason our economic models don't predict well for a macroeconomy. We don't know all the interconnections in that economy, and most climate scientists don't. No, I would not put it that way. No climate scientist knows all the interconnections that exist out there for the climate. Can we at least gather data and say what's happening to temperature? Sure, and we can gather it way up above the Earth, we can gather it at the Earth, we can gather it in the central business district, we can gather it out in the prairies, and then we can say, well, what's the average interest rate? Not a very relevant number if you're an economist, right? Nor is the average temperature very interesting. So we can gather data and make some statements. Do I think that those data in general suggest temperatures are rising? Yeah, I'm pretty well convinced that there's probably some upward trend in global temperatures. Do I think that they're caused by human action? Some. Do I think we can deal with it? Absolutely, if we have sensible policies that allow us to have economic growth. If we get the incentives right through market processes, I don't lose one wink of sleep over the global warming debate. I don't think the data are there to make us do that. I'd end by just saying, if you look at the kind of money we're talking about spending to deal with carbon emissions and ask what are we going to get, this one is not too debated in the climate debate, and that is we will get very little change in global temperatures over the next 100 years. And yet we will take draconian measures that will cause the biggest portion of this planet, the people on it, to be hungry, that will force them to live in poverty. Are we going to? I'm not too worried about it for me because I'm old already. Okay, I'm not even too worried about it for the students in this room because they are going to have enough of a capital stock of technology to live off of. But you continue to impose these policies for very long, that capital stock will be depreciated, and we will not have the wherewithal to deal with climate change if it is a big deal. So it is, again, adapt, don't regulate. One more. I'm a firm believer that the mind can absorb only as much as the butt can endure, and you guys have endured a lot, so one more.
So I may not ask a really well-formed question, but I would
Okay, I don't have to give a well-formed answer, which I haven't yet, so.
But what I'm really interested in is how do you see human population in all of this? And in particular, is there anything to the prescription in Garrett Hardin's article about the tragedy of the commons that for man to survive, we have to limit our population, put limits on our breeding? Because one thing that struck me in your talk, of course, was in Montana you don't have to worry about water, but you don't have too many people. Well, just because we can carry the population we have now doesn't mean there isn't some carrying capacity on the planet. And if we reckon that there is some capacity, you would think somehow we're going to have to deal with that problem at some point. So that's a poorly formed question, but I'm interested very much on your view of population and environmentalism.
Okay. Yeah, a great question, and the Malthusian pessimist statement in Václav Klaus's manifesto, if you will, gets to this, raises this question very well, I think. I'm not a Malthusian pessimist, I'm a rational optimist, so put my cards on the table right out of the chute. Start by saying, even if I grant you that there's a carrying capacity and stipulate along with you that this carrying capacity could be reached in a world where there's a tragedy of the commons, as Garrett described it, and then ask the question along with you, what should we do about it? I have to say, I don't see any system that's going to handle it. No system that has any modicum of individual liberty is going to handle it. And I have no faith that the government systems that we now understand, poor as they all are, even come close to handling it. I might I was at this conference in San Francisco this weekend, and one of the people said, "Oh yeah, your property rights stuff is great. It works in theory," and then began talking about cap and trade and carbon taxes. And I wanted to say, wait a minute. Your system only works in theory. We don't have a government out there that's clamoring to put cap and trade in place, that's clamoring to find the optimal carbon tax and implement it. That's a theoretical world. So I don't see anything other than a theoretical world where we could define this carrying capacity and then say, okay, only 1 point whatever we think the number is, births per is going to be implemented. So I just throw up my hands and say, even if I grant you all that, I don't have a system for dealing with it. But I'm not going to grant you that because I don't think that it's a problem. First, just look at the data. As people get rich, they stop having kids. Kids are a pain in, if you've had any, they're a pain in the rear. I mean, they're a huge drain on your capital stock for a long time, and it's hard to write a contract that gets them to pay you back. Okay, so rich people start to say, I'll take a little bit of, I'll maybe have one kid. It's, some consumption value in one kid, but, too many, I'm not going to go down that path. What we see in many countries in Europe already is they are not replacing their population. Now, if you're a guy like me about to go on Social Security, you do not want a system that isn't replacing the population with young people, because they're the people who are going to pay for my Social Security. They're going to be in deep doo-doo for all of their social programs when that hits the fan. But the point here is that we see some check just as a result of economic growth. But more importantly, and I commend to you Matt Ridley's book, The Rational Optimist. I don't see how you could possibly read a book like that and have anything other than optimism for our ability to overcome the carrying capacity. I don't see it as somehow, flying to the moon and harvesting the green cheese and living off of it. But what we find is that over and over again, we keep increasing that ability to feed the people we have. We keep increasing our ability to house the people we have. We keep increasing our ability to take care of the people we have. I am just a complete optimist with respect to what can happen if you unleash human ingenuity. Julian Simon, a good friend when he was alive, was fond of saying, with every mouth come 2 hands and a mind. The mouth eats stuff, but these 2 hands, some other 2 hands in mind, produce stuff. And when they do, that's the key to dealing with the problem Garrett Hardin talked about, not some kind of top-down regulatory approach. That means we have to have institutions that switch on the mind and switch on the ability to use those hands. We want those students studying for their exams, not redistributing the grades so that they don't study. If we can create that set of institutions, then I'm not the least bit worried about there being Malthusian limits. And whatever they are, we aren't even close. We aren't close on energy. We aren't close on feeding the world. We aren't close on using water more efficiently. We aren't close on managing the oceans better and harvesting the protein therein. I just don't see any real limits unless we take these 2 hands and this mind and we switch them off. It's possible to do that, and many countries do it, and when they do, then all bets are off. If you ask yourself, where do we have droughts, famines? They're in places with bad institutions. They can't feed their population because the 2 hands and the mind aren't at work. If we can overcome that, not only do we get to have a healthier economy, we get to have a better environment. Go Kermit. Thank you.